my dudes, you know the score with these artist workouts. We gotta do these every day, every single day. It only takes you 15 minutes a day to become a master, but what do you draw? Well, I got you covered, baby. These are real-time videos. I have a whole playlist here on my YouTube channel. Sometimes I refresh on the fundamental lesson that you're gonna need to know. Basically, we've got 15 minutes. I want you to draw along with me. Today we're drawing a speeder bike like you might see in a sci-fi movie like Star Wars or something when it was cool. Keep this playlist on repeat and you got yourself a timeline, a direct path to personal art mastery. Fire up your drawing program of choice, anyone will do, and let's dig into it. Let's draw. All right, let's start the timer. All right. So the first thing we do is we have our grid in the background, and you can obviously, if you don't already have this, then you can pick it up from my digital artist starter kit. It's free, a free download in the link below the video on my Gumroad channel. And put that perspective grid on the bottommost layer of your stack, set the opacity to 50%, draw on the layer above that. And the reason we use this grid is because it helps to create the illusion of 3D, and it's really helpful when you're doing your construction phase of drawing. In the construction phase, you're just drawing blocks. You're linking big blocks and cylinders and spheres together, and you're going to use that perspective grid to create believable depth. And you'll notice how like this point goes all the way down to that left vanishing point. Those dots are vanishing points. And this is what creates a sense of 3D. And so what you want to do is get really good at this so that you don't even need the grid anymore. You can just imagine that in your mind, and you can draw anything inside of a box. So when you're drawing, for instance, a car or a starship or a speeder bike, like what we're doing today, it's really helpful to start by drawing blocks. How much space does this thing take up? This is not that dissimilar if you get interested in 3D modeling or how video games are made, for example. You'll notice there's like a collision box, and the collision box is always a very simple geometry. Everything about your design is built within that geometry. And so like that way you can understand like how much space it's taking up. This is also true with humanoids when they're in 3D space. Like, you can draw any scene if you have an understanding of 2-point perspective. So I highly recommend, if you're not following what I'm doing here with the faces going into perspective, go back to some of the earlier videos in this playlist where I cover it extensively. I know that some 2D artists really have an aversion to 3D, doing 3D and learning 3D, but hugely beneficial in your drawing. And what's cool is once you've got a good handle on basic 2-point perspective, you can draw anything. In this case, even cylinders, to fit them into perspective, should fit into these box faces. So you can see with this handy little video recap where the circle is drawn onto the face, and then the face itself gets angled to the same vanishing points as the faces of our boxes in our construction of our speeder bike. So with that in mind, you can doodle in, and I'm not being too accurate because these are just doodles, 15-minute doodles, but it helps you to understand, like, when you're going back and cleaning it up and checking all of your lines, are these lines going to the proper vanishing point, for example? You can draw even cylinders in perspective, as well as humanoid figures, as well as organic elements as well. Everything fits into perspective if you want it to feel like a believable 3D space or a believable 3D object. We've covered that a lot when we were doing like the gun or the treasure chest or any of the other more blocky objects. And I find that it's easiest to teach people perspective with simple objects, but when you get into these things like these angled wings on this speeder bike, it gets a little tricky. And if you find that those angled things like a wing are just a little too confusing, like how does that work in perspective? Well, maybe just stick with like wings that stick straight out, for example, or straight up and down. When it comes to the design, I wanted to have kind of like almost a motorcycle handle, grips coming off of the side here with like a longer handlebars that are coming underneath a windshield, and then maybe some foot pedals that are hanging off the side. They get a little bit obscured by this wing that I have on the front motor part of the speeder bike, but it's okay. And it's okay also, one of the nice things about practicing like this is that you find it's okay to like doodle something in and maybe you change it. And you'll see me do that a couple of times in this video. I try to think about functionality when I'm designing so that in a lot of cases the function defines the form. And so, for example, you know, I thought, well, if they're really aggressive, then maybe they'd have like a cool scoop on the front or blades on the front of this thing, the speeder. Also probably want to have some headlights. That's why I kind of put these half headlights hanging off of the side of the big blocky motor part of the engine. So if you want to think about like what kind of an environment, you know, are they in? If you're doing a speeder that's in like a snowy kind of a setting, maybe you don't want it to hover at all. Maybe you want it to be on the ground, and maybe you want to do an actual ski underneath or have wheels on this thing, you know, that would actually allow, maybe you're designing something like a motorcycle, or, you know, you don't have to do, you know, a floating speeder bike like this. In fact, one of the points of this whole practice is to sit down and draw like a ship or a speeder bike or a vehicle every single day as your warm-up. Just get practice loosening up and like throwing ideas at the wall, seeing what works. One thing that I like to do is if I have a large flat surface, I'll put in some kind of a little object like a plate or something that breaks up that perfectly flat design so that the whole image doesn't have, or the whole design of the thing doesn't have too simple of a design. I like to have a little bit of decor. And yeah, if you start studying like how mechanisms work and servos and motors and you know, hinges and things like that, if you start getting into robotic design, for example, or vehicle design, you start to think more and more about functionality of things. And so you might think, well, I better put some kind of a way to cool off this motor under here, you know, and that's what you might see with some of the parts on here, you know, or maybe structurally it's not very sound because, you know, the front of this thing needs to like maybe blast through barricades, you know, and so like I thought, well, I'll just redesign this front of this thing to be a little bit more blocky, you know, and I also think that's just a better design, to be quite honest, a little bit more of a blocky design. But I thought the bottom of it was a little too flat, so I decided to kind of hollow that out a little bit so that there's almost a little bit of a scoop on the front, but it's still blunt in the front like a hammer. Basically, this thing is taking on a little bit more of a shape of like a hammer. And I also realized like these headlights, maybe they have wires that come back, and I also realized they're conflicting with this almost bumper that I want to put, this big metal bumper. So I'm going to slide that down. I use the selection tool to slide it down. This is also, by the way, excellent practice for just getting used to your tools. Whether you're using Sketchbook Pro, whether you're using Krita or Clip Studio or Procreate, or you're just drawing on paper, like just getting comfortable with the tools again. And remember, if anything's on that right side, it's got to go back to that vanishing point on the far right side, by the way. And anything on the left has to go back to that vanishing point on the left. All right, don't panic, but we're at just about the halfway point. 7 more minutes left. I think another important thing for you to remember is, especially when you're doing these little 15-minute workouts, it's a small commitment, right? So it's okay if your design don't entirely work. It's like maybe after you're done doing one of these designs, these doodles, or while you're in the midst of it, you're like, oh, I really want to try something that looks like a shark fin on the front of this thing, or maybe I want to try something that's got wings going at a different angle. You can feel free to explore those. They're only 15-minute, you know, practices, doodles. This is what you should be filling your sketchbook with. It's just like ideas. Maybe you could start thinking about story, and this is where it gets really fun. If you start thinking about like, well, maybe they have like a little astromech and there needs to be a little spot where those astromechs can, you know, park on this speeder bike thing, or are these sort of like pod racing bikes, or are they built for war? Are they built for transporting goods? You can start to ask interesting questions about the function of it and then start to apply them in a really simple, quick doodle kind of a form. And by the way, if you haven't realized, yes, we're studying the fundamentals of drawing, but we're also learning about storytelling. We're learning about where ideas come from. We're practicing those kind of explorations of your mind, of like where ideas can form, and also how they're visually told through your drawings. This is the thing that people don't understand about concept art, for example. It's not just about pretty pictures. It's about designing things with functionality and form in mind, and thinking creatively within confines of a built universe. So another thing to keep in mind is how some of the shapes, for example, on the front of the ship of this speeder bike might inform the shape on the back. So like I had these rounded lights, and then I realized everything on this thing is built with these 45-degree angles and these hard edges. Maybe the lights themselves also need to be consistent with that kind of construction. So if you have a certain kind of a curve in your speeder bike design, maybe you use that curve in other parts of your design as well. So there's a consistency. It looks like it's built by the same company. A big common mistake that I see a lot of artists do, especially beginners, is they might just throw in something that looks like a totally different designer built it on the front of the ship than the designer that built the back of the ship. And that breaks the immersion of it. I think if you look at, for example, the Star Wars universe, there are distinct design elements for a Corellian cruiser or cargo ship versus, like, say, a cargo ship or a cruiser that was built by a different manufacturer. So think about your designs like they're built by a manufacturer. I want to put a tail fin in the middle of this thing, but to find the middle, you have to draw an X and then draw a line straight up, and that finds the center point of your face when it's in perspective. And by drawing that back to the line in the back, I can also figure out, well, that's where the middle of the tail would be. And if I want it to be that tall, well, that's about where it needs to come up from. So these guidelines can be very effective. Notice, by the way, I did those guidelines on a different layer so I can just turn it off. And that's really important. You don't want to be drawing on that layer that has your grid on it, for example, or you'll have to redraw the whole thing or erase out the grid. That's annoying. But this helped me to find where's that center point of the tail so that I can have like a nice triangular 3-point tail wing, coming off of this thing between two motors on the back, beside each side of the saddle of the seat. Hang in there, guys. We only got a couple more minutes, so now would be the time to start tidying up your design a little bit. Maybe there's like some loose, sketchy, doodly parts that you want to add a little bit more depth to, or maybe even add a little bit of shadow to things. I like to create a new layer and then set that layer to darken, and then I'll do it all black, right? And I'll just start painting in, and then adjust the opacity down so I get a gray. Now this is on a whole new layer, so it's okay. It's just set to darken. So that allows me to really cut out this gives depth to your design. It'll make it look like there's a distinct difference between, the solid object that you're looking at and just the line weights, And by the way, this is all sort of almost bonus, just digging into lighting a little bit, digging into materials, but you don't want to dig into like detailing out the materials just yet. You're not trying to make this impressive painting. You're trying to just work out a design and see how it looks in a silhouette. And I do realize I burned through probably, I burned through about a minute to a minute and a half of my 15 minutes just filling in the solid, kind of a shape for this silhouette for this. But I think it is helpful because it really helps you to see what is this overall silhouette of your ship when you're doing these quick thumbnail type of doodles, for example. You want a quick readability on it, right? I also decided, just to add a little bit more depth to it because it's very geometric. I created another layer on top of that, and I'm just going to fill in like a generic top-down shadow, right? And by the way, keep in mind, again, on a separate layer so that I can, if I wanted to back off the dramatic, black of this, I can just lower the opacity on this one layer and it'll keep the depth of rendering, especially on things like underneath an object that you have sticking out, a geometric element like this wing. Like, see how adding that little shadow just really almost gives this incredible pop of depth. Just real quickly, it creates a depth. Even if your sketch is kind of loose, if you have really nice shadows on things, it will be very convincing. And it's even nice if you have loose, sketchy lines, but strong, confident shadows where you know how to project the light coming down onto surfaces. Can really sell your object. This is all construction, all fundamental stuff. less than a minute left, and now it's like, well, hey man, you know, go in and get a little nuts, have a little bit of fun, add in some interesting wings. I started to feel like maybe it almost looks like the barrel of a gun, so I added a little bit of these kind of like sights on the front, you know. Also, when it comes to rendering, like I don't want to dig into the rendering too much, but I thought it'd be nice to add a little bit of highlight to these corners so that they pop out a little bit more as metallic, and then kind of highlight a little bit of the surfaces that are facing the upper light. If we just have it sort of a close to a top-down, generic top-down light, you know. Mission complete, man. We did it. That's only 15 minutes, but you can kind of get a sense that, man, you could really dig in a little bit deeper. You could keep rendering a little bit more on this if you really like the design, or you could just go, well, that's all I had to practice today to just kind of get warmed up and kind of get my feet wet with thinking about drawing, thinking about 3D spaces. I got a little bit carried away. I was like, oh man, you know, maybe I could like add in some more exhaust pipes under the wing, and maybe really express a little bit more with some of these like metal plates where maybe you could access parts of the motor for repairs, or add a little bit, just a little bit more of that depth rendering, so you get a little bit of that light on the surfaces that are getting a little bit more light. You know, adding in some scratches and some dents and things that you just wouldn't do if you only have 15 minutes, right? But since we're just kind of exploring and having a little bit more fun with it, you know, I might as well add in a little bit of like some gradient maps and some colorizing layers and just get a little bit more fun with it. And this is a good opportunity for you to think less about any time constraints or any of the restrictions that you've had throughout this practice, and explore. And one thing that I would love to do is just create variations of this. Part of being a concept artist in video games is to create tons and tons of variations. And that means exploring new constructions, new shapes, and how those shapes could play out in a saddle or handlebars or in the front end of the design of this thing. And I might even go and do that in a future video. I think that would be fun to continue to explore what it means to be a concept artist and what it means to do iterative design. I do want to encourage you to draw along with me on these, and check out the playlist. There's lots of new challenges there for you to get better at drawing faces and buildings and vehicles and characters and humans. And of course, if you want some guided step-by-step lessons from me, I've got the Easy Art Lessons workshop over on my Gumroad channel. I've got that bundled together. There's over 40 lessons now. I just keep adding to it, teaching you the fundamentals in a fun way. So it's really designed for beginners to just grasp those fundamental concepts, and it's helped tons and tons of artists to even go pro. And if you just like my artwork, check out my video game. I got Twilight Monk. It's coming out on March 26th, 2025, and it's a Metroidvania RPG. I did all the art myself, directed it, and worked with a team of talented developers based on some novels I wrote. It's all a good time. So I of course, would love to have you subscribe here on my YouTube channel. I also would love to see your designs. So if you wanted to tag me over on X, please do so. I'll see you guys in the next video. All right, ciao.